Over the past few weeks, KCD2 has been embroiled in its own wokeness controversy. One that will likely have little, if any, impact on the game's actual quality from a design perspective. However, this debate is still worth discussing from a socio-cultural standpoint. Video games have become the dominant mass medium of our time. Just as theater once influenced the citizens of ancient Athens, today games shape political narratives and opinions for millions of consumers. This is a well-documented phenomenon, and it highlights why it's sometimes worth discussing a game beyond its entertainment value. A game's cultural impact isn't always tied to its gameplay or fun factor. Sometimes its most lasting influence comes from the ideas it promotes and the narratives it helps normalize. The controversy surrounding Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 has primarily focused on Henry suddenly being bisexual, despite assurances from the developers during the first game's release that he was not. However, an often overlooked aspect of this debate is the inclusion of Musa, a Malian traveler who arrives at Kutna-Hora, Kuttenberg, as part of Sigismund's court. According to the game's backstory, Musa joined Sigismund's forces after spending time at the court of Sultan Bayezid, the Ottoman ruler in 1403 when KCD2 takes place. This is something that is impossible to believe, simply because Bayezid and Sigismund were sworn enemies. They faced each other at the Battle of Nicopolis just a few years before the events of KCD2. After Sigismund's defeat, Bayezid personally searched for his corpse. Accounts from the era suggest that once Bayezid realized Sigismund had escaped, he ordered the execution of all non-noble Christian prisoners, an act of violence that shocked the entire Christian world. Yet in KCD2, one of Bayezid's courtiers is depicted accompanying Sigismund. From a historical accuracy standpoint, Musa's inclusion is arguably far more problematic than Henry being bisexual. While homosexuality undoubtedly existed in medieval Bohemia, sub-Saharan Africans did not. At least not in any proven numbers, and certainly not as part of Sigismund's court. Unlike Venice or Genoa, where African traders and diplomats could occasionally be found, Bohemia was far removed from such networks. The idea of a Malian traveler joining the Ottoman court and then ending up in Sigismund's army is historically implausible, or much rather completely impossible. As an Austrian, I don't take kindly to what appears to be a small but deliberate attempt to rewrite Central European history. The inclusion of Musa doesn't seem like a simple creative liberty. It aligns far too closely with modern ideological trends, particularly those influenced by the European BLM movement. In 2023, while I was working at the Austrian Ministry of Culture, I saw firsthand how the left-wing Green Party, which controlled the ministry at the time, funneled tens, if not hundreds of thousands of euros into Black Lives Matter-related project. This ideological push wasn't limited to Austria. It affected other Central European countries as well. One of the major trends in academia and the cultural institutions between 2020 and 2024 was the effort to rediscover Black history in Central Europe. This wasn't about genuine historical curiosity, but rather a historically motivated attempt to prove that Black people had a significant presence in historic Europe. In some cases, it was even tied to efforts to link Central European countries like Austria, the Czech Republic, or Hungary to colonial crimes, despite the fact that the Austrian Habsburgs never had any colonial holdings in Africa. Though the exact funding details of these projects aren't public, many of them are still visible today. When you, for example, look at the city archives of major cities like Vienna, you will see that there were significant resources spent on looking for evidence of Black people in medieval towns. While there wasn't enough material for any major publications, you can still often find entries in the various official history wikis of many cities, like the Vienna History Wiki. Museums across Austria, but also many other Central European countries, were holding special workshops on racism sensitivity, often held by BLM activists. I know for a fact in the case of one museum here in Vienna, the Technical Museum here, that the workshop was clearly held by two BLM Austria activists, and they furthermore also organized multiple exhibitions which were influenced by BLM consultants and tried to frame Austria and the Holy Roman Empire in the context of colonial crimes. These exhibitions were partially funded by a special ministry budget. The Czech Republic saw similar initiatives. For example, in 2022, shortly after the rise of Black Lives Matter, the University of Hradec Králové launched a research project on Afro-Czechs, despite the term Afro-Czech not existing in any meaningful sense before this entire BLM movement took off. These are just a few examples of a broader push to reframe Central European history and culture to fit a far-left American-inspired narrative. If America has African Americans, then there must be Afro-Czechs, Afro-Austrians, and so on and so forth. And of course this logic extends to historical media, where representation must be included even when it contradicts historic reality. Given this broader cultural shift I tried to present to you, I find it very likely that Musa's inclusion in KCD2 is a relic of this era. An era when dozens of, for lack of a better term, left-wing grifters in academia received substantial funding to rewrite Central European history. This is why, even though I don't think Musa will make KCD2 unplayable or significantly worsen the gaming experience, I am deeply opposed to his inclusion on ideological and political grounds. We are only now beginning to slowly push back against the influence of far left-wing American ideology in our cultural institutions. For the Czech Republic, this process will likely only gain real momentum after their parliamentary elections in October. Yet, just as we are slowly shaking off these far-left influences, Warhorse decided to include a Malian character in KCD2. Kingdom Come Deliverance is a massive deal in the Czech Republic, almost a matter of national pride. That's likely why Daniel Vavra, who was bold and outspoken on Twitter, has now spent the past 2 weeks on Czech Facebook trying to explain that his game isn't woke and that it remains respectful towards Czech history and culture. The main issue that many people in Central Europe have with KCD2 isn't Henry suddenly being bisexual, but rather the inclusion of Musa. His presence feels like a foreign ideological influence that diluted the game's narrative vision, despite Warhorse's claims to the contrary. In Europe, categorizing people primarily by race rather than ethnicity has been frowned upon ever since World War II. We distinguish people based on their cultural and ethnic backgrounds, not along arbitrary racial lines that don't even make sense in the European context. Take the American concept of Caucasian, for example. The Caucasus is a mountain range in Russia, and Caucasians actually are an ethnic group, but they are a very small ethnic minority within the Russian Federation. But by the US logic of Caucasian, the French, the Ukrainians, and the Russians would all be considered the same Caucasians, even though they belong to very different ethnic and cultural groups. Musa's inclusion, therefore, isn't just historically inaccurate. It reflects a refusal to stand by European norms and values in favor of pandering to American far-left ideologues. You wouldn't see widespread demands for black representation in a historical video game anywhere outside the US, and maybe possibly the UK. Most people in Central or Eastern Europe wouldn't even think of the idea of putting black people into a historic video game. If Warhorse wanted more diversity in KCD2, there were plenty of more realistic options. Many unique foreign ethnicities could be represented in the game, ones that are geographically and historically relevant to medieval Bohemia. From Ottoman Turks to Romanian Shkelis, Greeks and Jews, the realistic choices for diversity are virtually endless. These groups would also allow for representation of rarely, if ever seen ethnicities, which deserve some more representation. The problem with that would be that most of these groups have lighter skin, and many Americans don't seem to understand that people can share a skin color while belonging to vastly different ethnic and cultural identities. Of course, one can argue that Warhorse is an independent development studio that makes its own decisions without any foreign influences, but that idea has no relation to objective reality, where surrounding trends of course influence a product. The influence of American cultural narratives on European institutions is rather undeniable, largely due to the overwhelming soft power the US exerts in academia, business and entertainment. Even today, many European university professors aspire to positions at American colleges, reinforcing the idea that the academic discourse in Europe often follows trends set in the US. Similarly, the way companies are structured, how media is produced, and even how entertainment is marketed are all shaped primarily by the American industry standards. This extends to the gaming industry as well. While Warhorse is a Czech studio, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It operates in a global market where American companies set the tone. Major publishers, investors, and even most of the gaming press are overwhelmingly based in the US. As a result, even European developers often find themselves aligning with dominant Western industry trends, whether for perceived financial reasons or to remain in good standing with the industry. Rather than seeing Musa's inclusion as a purely local creative choice, it's more likely a byproduct of this larger Western trend. European studios, whether willingly or reluctantly, often adopt American cultural frameworks to ensure perceived marketability in the West. This isn't necessarily about direct political activism. It's simply how modern entertainment industries function under American-dominated soft power. All of these surrounding factors make the inclusion of Musa feel disingenuous. Why was it necessary to have a Malian character in a medieval Bohemian setting, especially when there are other perspectives that could have been explored? If Warhorse wanted to incorporate a Muslim viewpoint, there were far more historically plausible options. For instance, an Ottoman Turk or a traveler from Mamluk-ruled Egypt and the Middle East would have fit the time period much more realistically. Ultimately, Musa's inclusion doesn't just feel anachronistic. It comes across as an attempt to pander to far-left American cultural sensibilities. There is simply no other explanation for why a sub-Saharan African would be placed in a game set in medieval Central Europe. In the real world, black people are almost non-existent in the region, with Austria's population being less than 1% and the Czech Republic having even fewer. Outside major cities, you would be hard-pressed to find a single sub-Saharan African. Even in modern-day Kutna Hora, there are probably absolutely no Malians. It is for this reason why the idea of black representation never was something that existed in Central Europe, because it was just never a relevant topic. We have other issues with representing ethnic minorities, I won't deny that, but they were never centered around the idea of us needing to have black people in our historic entertainment or in us having to do major research into black history in Central Europe. Those things only came over to Central Europe after the BLM movement took off in the US. And this is why Musa's problem is such a problem. It undermines the historical accuracy of the game and dilutes European history, identity, and culture to cater to ideologies that don't align with the region's reality. It feels like an attempt to appease a small group of far-left activists, many of whom recently lost political influence. Looking back, I'm sure Daniel Vavra regrets the decision to include Musa in KCD2, especially with the hindsight of how the cultural landscape has shifted. But I can also understand why it seemed like a sensible choice during the development of KCD2, when the BLM movement was at its peak and these ideological trends were everywhere, even in Central Europe where they were never a topic before. In the end, the inclusion of Musa in KCD2 feels like a missed opportunity to tell a more grounded, historically accurate story. While the game excels in bringing medieval Bohemia to life with its incredible attention to detail, adding a character like Musa, who doesn't belong in that historical context, only weakens the world they've built. Warhorse's decision to include Musa, whether driven by external pressures or internal misjudgments, detracts from the authenticity that made the First Kingdom come so unique. The lesson here is that historical fiction is at its best when it respects the context of its setting. When games like KCD2 start bending history to fit modern political agendas, it's not just the story that suffers, it's the credibility of the entire game world. If we want to see more diversity in gaming, let it come from characters who belong in their time and place, rather than from forced inclusions that feel out of place and ultimately distract from the experience. But that would be everything from me. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay toasty. Cheers.